These are all the books I read in January. Hi, I'm Callie and I talk about books and writing. If you're new here, that's what we do here. We talk about the books that I read and the writing projects I'm working on and the books I'm releasing. Today, we're going to talk about all the books I read in January, and it was kind of a crazy month. I came up with some parameters for at least the first half of 2025, and I'll decide if I want to stick with them, that are kind of like slots I have to fill every month. And so this was my first month doing it, and it went okay. It didn't go great, but it went okay. I know my voice sounds kind of weird. I've had a horrible cold for the last week. I'm actually currently waiting for my iced chai latte to get cold because our ice maker is broken. So we don't have any ice. And I've had so many cups of hot tea in the last week that I just don't want another one. I've already had 2 this morning. I just want something cold. I don't have any ice. So it's sitting in my freezer for a few minutes. Probably gonna take a break halfway and go get it so I can drink it while we're watching. The categories that I have to fill every month, specifically January, are 2 romance novels, 1 big fat book I read part of, a physical copy wildcard, 2 book of the month picks, and an ebook. I did something close to that, not 100% that, but close to it. I got close, okay? Let's start with the romance novels. The first one I read was A Good Debutante's Guide to Ruin by Sophie Jordan. It's the first book in the Debutante Files. I finished this on January 1st. So it's been a while since I read it. It is about a man who's like estranged stepsister shows up. He's a duke, and it's basically like our parents, her mother and his father, who have remarried after the loss of their spouses, kind of forgot about me at finishing school, and I've stayed way too many years, and I've been working as like a teaching assistant, but they were finally like, no one's paying your tuition, we didn't hire you, you have to leave. And she has nowhere to go, so she just kind of shows up at his house, and he's like, okay, we're gonna find you a husband, you're cute or whatever, it's not gonna be too bad. And then you can imagine where it goes from there. In December, I read a ton of Sophie Jordan books. I read the other 2 in this series. I read a short novelette she wrote. I read her novella that was in a Christmas collection, so many. I will say that this has been my least favorite Sophie Jordan series I've read so far. I liked it. Usually I'm over the moon in love with her books. These felt just like more like run-of-the-mill Regency historicals, which is still something great to fall into, but not like the grabbing me by the collar Sophie Jordans that I usually just can't get enough of. The next one I put in a romance slot, which honestly this could have gone in romance or it could have gone in fantasy, but I put it in romance, was The Witch Collector by Teresa Weeks. This is like high fantasy romantasy with a woman who is a very powerful witch, but it's kind of like hidden that she is. She can't speak, and in their world magic is done through incantations, so she uses a type of sign language. And then the Witch Collector is a man who comes from like the main city where their ruler lives to towns to collect very powerful women to help protect their king. The vibes in here are very winter. They're a little bit enemies to lovers, but I wouldn't really classify this as an enemies to lovers because they are enemies for such a short period of time, and it's only on her side. She hates this man. I keep saying she. Raina hates Alexis, who's the Witch Collector, so much. Or Alexis? I don't know how they pronounce it. She hates him so much, but very soon after they meet, they are in a situation in which they need each other to survive. So, and they don't really hate each other anymore. So I wouldn't say if you're looking for like a really like deep enemies to lovers that this would be a good choice. I do think if you like romantasy, if you like, I only read the first book in ACOTAR, but it had a similar vibe to that. I think you'd really like it. What I found out about myself while reading this is I'm not really a romantasy reader. There's a very, very, very specific type of romantasy I like, and it's historical romantasy. So I like books in an accurate historical setting with a touch of fantasy that are romances, basically all of Julianne Marillier's books. But the world building, and it was wonderful and very well built. I just was a little bit like not 100% into it. I do think that if you are a romantasy reader, you would really like this book. I'm just finding that I'm not a romantasy reader. I'm more of a paranormal romance girl, which you can tell by what I write. Okay, so my next slot is my big fat book I'm going to read part of, and I've been trucking away at The Secret History. So I wanted to read 2 chapters in January, which was like, I don't know how many pages. A lot, though, because her chapters are really long, and I read one. So I read chapter 5, which was, I'm going to look it up exactly so I can make myself feel good about this. It was just under 100 pages. And I really, really wanted to read 2 chapters, but it just didn't happen. And honestly, I'm worried this book is just going to take me forever to read because I'm filming this on February 10th and I have not picked it up again since I read that chapter. So I think this is going to be like a 1 chapter a month. So I sort of have to think about that in terms of what my reading is going to look like because of that. In my defense, as you will see later in this wrap up, this was not my only big fan book, even though I didn't know about it. The Secret History is a lit fic dark academia about a group of people at a small liberal arts college in New England in, I think we're like the late 80s. And they're not good people, like any of them. So that's part of the reason I think I'm having a hard time with this. They don't really adhere to the same moral code as the rest of the world. And we're going to see how I end up feeling about this. I don't know. Right now, I'm very much on the fence. Now let's talk about my wild card, which is the first issue I ran into. So I told myself at the beginning of January, my wild card read was either going to be Faithful by Alice Hoffman or The Great Believers by Rebecca Makkai. I ended up picking up Faithful. So one night I was literally like, I kind of want to just go nuts and just like read for like 3 hours, which with Alice Hoffman books, I sometimes can. Not always, but like a few, like Blackbird House, The Ice Queen, those are books that I just sat, I think Skylight Confessions, I just sat down and read them like nonstop, just read without taking a break for hours. So I was like, I kind of want to do that tonight. Little did I know. In a book I'm going to talk about in the future of this wrap up, I had the night before read a rough first person POV sexual assault scene. And it had been bad because it was on my Kindle. And so I was reading it because I couldn't fall asleep. That made it so I really couldn't fall asleep. And I ended up having to read something else instead. But that was in the forefront of my brain, okay? You know me. Sometimes I can read first person sexual assault. Sometimes I cannot. And so when I was on page, I don't know. I got to page 18. So it was probably, I'm actually going to look. I bet I can find it. Page 11 of this book. There is also a first person sexual assault and of a teenage girl. And I just, it like hit me like a weight on my chest. So I ended up only reading to page 18, putting it down and being like, I don't know if I want to read this book. It wasn't like it wasn't the same as the book I'd already read, which had like a very intense multiple page long scene. This was like 2 paragraphs, like, and very like lit ficky done. But I still just couldn't get in a headspace where I could keep reading this book. So I put this book down and I don't know if I'm gonna read this book, which makes me sad because I love Alice Hoffman. But I'm like, you know what? It's okay. I don't have to love everything Alice Hoffman writes. I didn't like the one about Maria Owens. I DNF'd that after like 50 pages. For now, this is being put away. So what did I do about a wild card? Because I felt like I couldn't read this. And honestly, I know The Great Believers is about the AIDS crisis. So I was like, I don't know if I really want to read that either. I was like getting really sad about what I was picking to read. And so I instead decided my wild card was going to be 1,000 Mornings by Mary Oliver. In my TBR for January, I talked about maybe reading a couple poems out of this. And I decided I was just going to read this whole book as my wild card because I needed a little bit of just like poetry before bed. And it was really lovely. I'm not a huge poetry reader, but I do like probably like once or twice a year to pick up a book of poems. And they were very beautiful. The first poem is fantastic. It was probably the best poem in the book, which makes sense. Start off on a great foot. And it's called I Go Down to the Shore. But there were a bunch of other ones, and I wish I had written them down. For I Will Consider My Dog Percy was very, very good and very beautiful. And that's one of the last ones. I'd recommend that one as well. Mary Oliver is probably one of the most popular modern-ish day poets. I know she died recently, but I definitely will pick up another book of her poetry because I liked my time with this. And it was what I needed after the roughness of those other reads. Moving on. I was supposed to read 2 book of the month this month. I only read 1. I'm not going to lie. With Faithful, with The Witch Collector, which I thought I was going to fly through, but ended up taking me a long time, with another book I'm about to talk about after this one, with The Secret History, with The Good Debutante's Guide to Ruin, not being like a normal Sophie Jordan that just fills me with all the good feelings in the world. I was having a little bit of a rough reading month. And so with the book of the month books that I had in my queue were Ninth House by Leah Bardugo, A Sea of Unspoken Things by Adrienne Young, and then the one I'm going to tell you about right now. And I decided I was only going to read the one right now because of a few reasons. One, A Sea of Unspoken Things by Adrienne Young. I'm reading it right now, but it is about a twin. It's a twin who's lost their twin who dies. And so I knew that was going to be a rough read for me emotionally as a mother of twins. So when I was feeling all those like not great feelings in January, I decided it wasn't the time for me to read it. Also, Adrienne Young's books are really medium paced, bordering on slow. And I felt like I needed something a little more snappy to get me through the month. Ninth House, I'm going to read when I feel like reading it because it's also dark academia, and because The Secret History is taking me so long, I don't know if I'm going to read that before summer or even next fall, and that's fine. I'm kind of putting that in a section of its own, a place of its own. So what I read in January was A Killing Cold by Kate Alice Marshall. This was a good choice, okay? This is a winter vibes thriller. We've got a woman who is newly engaged to a man who is very wealthy, and she has a really weird past that you learn about slowly throughout the book. Her very wealthy fiance has invited her to come to this compound his family owns in the middle of the mountains that's beautiful log cabins and stuff, but there's no cell service and you're very far away from the rest of the world. Our heroine is Theo, our hero / her fiance is Connor, and I really liked this. This was exactly what I needed this month. It's snowing, there's murder, there's intrigue, there's weird crap going on. Theo is very secretive about her upbringing. She always says that she doesn't have any family left, which is true. She was adopted by a couple when she was 4 or 5 and has no memories of her mother or father from before then. And she ends up being one of the kids who is sadly adopted by people who are not necessarily good parents. When she comes to this place in the mountains with Connor's family, she starts getting memories from before that time, and we go from there. I really enjoyed it. I recommend it if you want to feel cold and scared. Not super scary. It was because I'm a baby. I'm a scaredy cat, but it was scary enough for me. Let's talk about the ebooks. Okay, so here's the thing. I read a big fat book this month, a huge book in its entirety, without even knowing it. North is the Night by Emily Rath. Here's the beautiful cover that totally sold me. I got an ARC for this. NetGalley, which is where I get my ARCs from, recently sent us users a survey about what we would also like. And one of the things I would also like before I commit to a book is a page count, because I don't like reading very long books, as you all know. I'm literally forcing myself to read long books. I read this book in its entirety, and it took me such a long time, to the point that it kind of colored my review of it, to think it was very boring because it was taking me so long to read this book. Friends, this book was 592 pages long. It was 8 pages away from being a 600-page book. I never would have requested the ARC for a book that was almost 600 pages long by an author I've never read before. Oh my gosh, that would have been insane. But here we are. I picked this book because it was a fantasy with Finnish folklore, and I was in a Finland mood. I get in country moods sometimes. I was in a Finland mood. I would say that if you are really interested in knowing the ins and outs of Finnish mythology, this probably wouldn't be a great one to start with. It was more inspired by Finnish mythology and grabbed a couple gods and goddesses to follow. We have 2 narrators, Siri and Anya, I think is how you say it, or Aina, something like that, and they are best friends. And young women have been disappearing from their towns nearby, and they're not exactly sure why. Also, there has been a flood of missionaries from Sweden who are spreading Christianity and sort of taking over the old religion, which is a trope I like. A lot of my favorite historical fantasies are about the spread of Christianity throughout Britain, so I thought I'd really like this one. Very early in the book, Aina, whatever her name is, she gets kidnapped by one of the Finnish gods of death. There's a lot of them. There's a lot. And Siri decides she's going to try to go save her from basically the underworld. Okay, so that's like what starts. So we follow Siri on her path to try to find the shaman who's going to help her get into the underworld. And we follow Anya or Aina, whatever her name is, as she's living in the underworld now and trying to survive. This is the book that had the bad first POV sexual assault, just so you know. And so that really, I had already read though, like 100 pages. Probably not 100. Probably 100 pages. And so I felt committed to the book. So I didn't want to put it down. Also, I have an arc for it. I have to review it for NetGalley. You don't have to, but you're not supposed to not review too many books. So I was like, I'm going to finish this book. I think the thing I had a hard time with is this book was pitched as a sapphic romance, which the publisher has pulled back on that because the author was like, I don't know why they pitched it as a sapphic romance. There's a tiny bit of that. But overwhelmingly, we're talking about a 592-page book, over 500 pages, there isn't any of that. So I was a little bit confused, but before I finished it, I went and read some reviews and realized that's not what it was, because there is like literally one of the characters you think is falling in love with someone else who is a man, and they're separated almost the entire book. So it was a little bit not what it was sold to me as, which is fine. It's just weird when you're reading something and you're like, are these two supposed to be falling in love? Are they going to be in the same dimension anytime soon and be able to communicate with each other? Overall, I think I gave this book 3 stars, maybe 2.5. I didn't love it, partially because I had no idea how long it was. So when I was reading it, I thought it was really boring and slow because it was taking me so long to get through it, which might mean that it is, but I don't fly through 600-page books. So I would maybe give it a different review if I had known how long it was. No, I wouldn't have, because I would never have picked it up. Another weird thing about me is I don't want to read a book that's over 400 pages on my Kindle because I get really bogged down by ebooks that I don't read fast. It's just like a weird thing about me. So overall, you might like it. I think reviews are pretty mixed. It's a duology because it ends with like a pretty big cliffhanger. I'm not going to finish it. That's okay. And then my last read. Remember how I said that I was reading at night because I couldn't sleep, and then there was that awful scene and I had to read something else? I opened Claimed by the Lumberjack by Clara King, and I'm glad I did. You know why? This was what I wanted it to be. This was a woman who her sister blames an arson on her, and she's running through the woods away from the police, and she winds up being found by this lumberjack who nurses her back to health, and then they have a whirlwind romance in his cabin in the woods. And it was a solid 4-star read, and I can totally fall asleep after I read something like this. That was what I needed when I have my insomnia, and so that is what I got. It was just what I needed. So looking at what I wanted to read for the month and what I did read 2 romance novels. I did read part of The Secret History, even though it wasn't as much as I wanted to. I technically read a wildcard book, even though it was a small book of poetry and not like an actual novel-sized book. Fine. I only read 1 book of the month book instead of 2, but I read 2 ebooks, and one of them was a monster. So I feel okay about that. I do. I feel okay. I feel like I did a pretty good job staying in the parameters. I'm going to do much worse in February unless the second half of the month ends up being a heavy reading 2 weeks for me. This month is so short. It always makes it hard to figure out how many books I'm going to be able to read. There's 3 extra days in January compared to February. So that is everything I read in January. If you're still here, thank you for hanging out. In the comments, let me know what you read in January. Has anybody else read North is the Night? North of the Night, North is the Night. I'm gonna say it wrong now. And what did you think of it? That's the only brand new release? No, A Killing Cold, which was my book of the month pick. Killing Cold was an early release. So I think it's just hitting bookstores now in February. I don't think it was actually out in January. So of my 2 brand new books, if you read either of them, tell me what you think. And tell me what you think about any of those books. Do you like Mary Oliver? I found her poetry pretty good. That was my first time reading a whole collection of Mary Oliver books. If you made it this far in the video and you don't want to write words, I will take a bright sunshine emoji, because you may have noticed I'm not sitting in my normal spot. And that is because that side of the room, where my other bookcase is like this. This is my nonfiction bookcase / my husband's books. So you can see all these wonderful sports themed books. By my fiction bookcase, the sun is so bright that the glare of my glasses made it so I couldn't see. So I'm in a different spot. But I'll take a sunshine emoji because we are having a very sunny winter, which I guess is fine, but it's very blinding. Okay, that's all for me. As always, I hope you're in the middle of a good book, about to start reading a good book, or about to start writing a great book. I'll see you soon.